Okay, so for this lecture, we're gonna go over a couple things. We're gonna go basics of routing for reverbs and time of bass effects, and then we're gonna delve into the different components of reverb, that how we use to understand reverb, and how um, manufacturers and software programmers use these different components to create reverbs. Okay, so let's start with the basics. How you should route time-based effects should be using a bus send to an auxiliary track. Um, so if you see here on my vocal track, I have several sends, and like I've mentioned in class before, you are going to name all these buses according to the job: long verb, mono delay, vox verb, ambient verb. I have down here PCM90 and Bricasti. That is for analog inserts. I have created as aux sends also. So you create a bus send. So now you have independent control of how much of that vocal I'm sending to the long verb. Why do it this way instead of putting just that plugin on the vocal? That gets tied into how I start the reverb lecture. I want you guys to start visualizing reverb as a stage that you have to create for this whole performance to start. Just like you hear on that song Spanish Harlem, where you hear this kind of unified space where all the instruments are living in, that should be a great place for you to start, because everybody in this band is together on one stage. On a song like this, and with modern production, everything gets recorded in isolation, or most things get recorded in isolation, in nice, clean, dry studios that are devoid of any type of reverb or ambience, or very little of it, right? So now, when you just pull up a mix, everything sounds dry, flat. There's no depth. There's no real movement in back and forth in this case, besides what you can get out of volume automation or compression, right? So it's good to envision, how is this stage going to be? Is this going to be a small club? Is this going to be a living room? Is this going to be a 200 seat venue, or is this going to be a 2,000 seat concert hall, or is this going to be outdoors, right? Um, and all of this is going to affect the overall tonality, in the overall sound of your song, and the how the energy gets transmitted to that audience. Do you want it close and personal? You use a tighter room. Is this going to be a power ballad, and you want these big long verbs with delays and everything else, so when that singer hits that big note, it just keeps resonating for 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds there, and it sounds endless, but it sounds beautiful, right? So if you put a plugin on the vocal, a reverb plugin on the vocal, and you dial up something interesting, you are just putting that vocal in that space, and you're depriving the rest of the instrumentation of sharing that space. Yes, you can copy paste that plugin to all the different other instruments, but you are wasting resources, CPU processing resources, that way. You create a aux, put whatever reverb you're going to create as your staging unifying reverb, and you send all the instruments, you create a bus send on all the instruments to that reverb, and then you start making decisions on where to and how much to apply to each. Okay? Does that mean that you're going to have just one reverb for everything? No. there are multiple applications and uses of reverb. The one I'm starting with right now is creating a stage and defining the depth of that. Okay.
I do have a question, Aaron, real quick. So when
Go for
you
it.
do set up those reverbs, are you creating each kind of reverb you want to use and then seeing which one you want to go with after that, or do you do it after you EQ'd and compressed the instruments themselves?
Good question. Um, Either or, depending how I'm feeling. But
I see.
let's define that just a little bit. The process that I've gone through till this class doesn't necessarily define the process that I always work, or the process that I recommend everybody do, which is start with EQing, then compress, then add verb. Um, I would say I might start with correction EQ as the first thing, as I'm listening to a whole mix and I'm hearing frequency masking issues between instruments. If I'm hearing low end definition issues because there's a couple of instruments that have low frequency information that might or might not be necessary, I start correcting and doing the bass management stuff. And then I start trying to figure out how can I make all these instruments get separated with just some subtractive EQing and fine tuning this way. That still, I still consider that part of the rough mix preparation process. So now you have a performance that's clean and clear, and you can start working from there. And once you've done that, now you should proceed to start creating the space for that instrument. And I put that provision there just because if you're having frequency masking issues or bass management issues, muddiness happening, the verb is just going to make it worse, right? So I start there, but you you if you start EQing and compressing and then you add verb, you could walk into issues where EQ helps shape and define tone. Compression also helps shape and define tone. Verb will definitely shape and define tone. So you might be adding equalization, you might be compressing a certain way because you're wanting to get this result. And then as soon as you throw the reverb, that result gets blown up, and now there's too much of that end result because you did it devoid of the space that that instrument's going to be sitting in. So if you start with the space and you try to define the space and place the instruments within the stage, then you get into additive EQing and compression to shape those instruments within this space. You might end up noticing that you get better results, maybe even quicker results. All these skill sets take time to develop. And I'm not saying just do it this way. I'm saying for this class, start with reverbs, right? As an experiment, as a process, as a different workflow. I end up working however I feel like it. And but what I mean about that, if I listen to a song and it got recorded in a way that it's so dry that I'm not really feeling the vibe and the energy of a song just by the rough mix, I might start dialing reverbs, and not just reverbs to create a space, but also reverbs to create an effect and other time based things to create some excitement and movement to it. And once I've created that, then I'm like, okay, I'm thrilled with the song. I'm liking the direction. Now let's start refining with some EQ. Let's start compressing that performance to make these instruments sit a little better where I want it to.
Okay.
But I've gone through all these different ways of working, where sometimes I feel like I just have to start with a reverb. Other times I feel like there's too much correction to do before I can start thinking about anything else. Cool?
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah. And at this point, you know how my answers are. It all depends. But trying to at least explain some of that mentality, right? Okay, so um, when you're using time-based effects, again, use aux sends and use buses to send all these instruments to that one unifying reverb. Okay, that doesn't mean that you can't put a reverb plugin on that instrument if the decision that you're making is a decision of sound design versus creating space and reverb in creating space and depth in a mix. And let's define those two things quickly. If you create a synth pad, and that synth pad is sort of like a string pad, and you're trying to make that synth pad work in a certain way, you might add a little bit of delay to it, so it almost has like a little slapback bounce to it. And then you might add a little chorusing to just make it wider and modulate a little bit and move. And then you might add a little verb, so as you're hitting this string pad and it is a kind of stab staccato pulse that you're doing, you want that reverb to just tail off just a little bit so it fills out that little space a little bit better and it helps it kind of sit in. And you're making these decisions as you're dialing that synth pad, as you're producing the track. That I would define as sound design. That is all those effects that you added are an integral part of how that instrument is supposed to sound and react within that arrangement. And that has nothing to do, to a certain degree, with reverb placement and depth in a stage. That just becomes an arrangement decision on how you dial up that instrument tonal wise, function wise within the arrangement. So the other reason I don't recommend you putting reverbs on each channel is because now you're stuck with a dry wet. And like I've mentioned before with parallel compressing, I don't like to be stuck with less than 100% of that source. If I am mixing a vocal, I want to always have 100% of that dry vocal to work with. And if I put a plugin on it and I put a dry wet and I just say, oh, I put it at 80% dry, that means I'm losing 20% of the dry signal. So to me, in my head, it's messing with my gain staging. If I have that vocal dry exactly where I want it, why am I going to decrease it by 20%? Why am I going to force myself to decrease it by 20%? I can put an aux, leave the vocal where it is, add verb, and after I added the verb where I think it needs to be, if now that vocal was in its entirety, well, after I added the verb becomes a little too present, a little too forward, a little too full, now I can lower that vocal channel, which will also lower the send to that verb, and now I found a better placement for that verb, for that vocal. Okay? So how do we do this? Again, you create an aux, you create a bus send. I have several different buses already created as part of my template. I tend to always have an ambient verb, short verb, long verb, short delay, medium delay, long delay. I tend to have a vox verb as a specially dialed up verb for the vocals, which tends to be more of like a plate verb, so it has a specific character to it, not necessarily thinking about it in the sense of staging, but more as a tonal shaping effect. Okay, and then you'll see that I have just an effects bus that could be different random things that I put time-based stuff, choruses and stuff, guitar effects, guitar delays. I have several things already created in my template. So I create that send. And then over here you see the bus. I I start dialing up that stage by putting the fader all the way up to 0. So I'm sending 100% of the vocal, in this case, to that verb. And I am temporarily, and I repeat this, only temporarily am I going to hit pre-fader. After I'm done dialing this up, I'm going to take the pre-fader out and finish dialing up the verb how I feel I need it. Okay? I'll explain why. Let's start with the song. Same song we've been using this semester.
Where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside.
So as we have this song here, that vocal, he's kind of talking, singing at the same time. He's not singing out. He's right on the mic, and just has a nice easy flow that just kind of rolls through time, right? But since he's not singing out, and you have the rest of this performance that's there's a certain groove and pocket that everybody's hitting. The drums, the bass, and the guitars are accenting that, right? And then you hear a couple other guitar layers that has some effects already. There's a certain nice ambience defined within this production. This vocal sounds so dry, it's in your face, so let's try to figure out a space of where it can fit correctly. Most people pull up a verb and then start kind of pulling this up and listening to it, and might fiddle with the effects a little bit, and then just fiddle with the adjustment a little bit, and then there, I have now applied reverb. Yes, you have applied reverb, but have you defined and created that space accordingly? Have you ever sat down to just process the verb by itself? Either of you, that's a question for you guys. Have you actually ever soloed the verb and designed a verb that way just by listening to the verb?
No, I've never done that.
Does that make sense to you to do it that way?
It does, like, as I'm watching you do it, like it's kind of making the way I've used verbs seem very like general.
Okay. Which tends to be the way that everybody starts, me too, until I was taught that so much happens when you just define it this way. This can be very unnerving to a client, and especially if that client is in the room with you when you're mixing, and suddenly they're gonna hear this. I'm gonna activate the aux. I'm gonna put it in pre-fader, right? And I'm gonna now solo the voice, and I'm now gonna mute the voice. So I'm not gonna hear the voice, but the solo makes it so it's gonna be the only track playing. But since I put pre-fader on the sends, the vocal is still being sent to the bus, but the vocal dry is not being sent to the mix bus. Follow?
Okay, so you only have audio coming through the reverb bus send to that aux. Okay, gotcha.
And that's how you just audition the reverb, and the result is this.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too.
And trust me, the first reaction of clients is like, oh my God, is he applying that much reverb to the vocals? This is going to sound horrible. Why am I here? What is he going to do to my song? It's kind of interesting to look at the clients' faces and have them freak out. And then sometimes they'll ask, it's like, I think I want a little less verb than that. Or sometimes I just look at their faces and they're like, don't worry, I'm just dialing something up. I'm going to turn this down in a little bit. And then you can see them, they're like, Oh, okay, good. But this is how you can actually hear what the verse, what the vocal, how the vocal's reacting to the verb, right?
And where can we go
And
from
now I
here?
can unmute the
I know you
vocal.
I felt it too. Well, I think I know.
Now you can control both independently from each other in that sense, okay? So now let's start explaining the different components. In this class, I am breaking down reverb into three categories. You have early reflections, you have pre-delay, and you have reverb decay. Early reflection is the tonality of the verb that is defined by the materials that space has. For example, if you're in a bathroom that has tile floor to ceiling, that bathroom is going to sound very bright, shimmery, and reverberant because there are solid, glossy material that's going to be highly reflective. If now you move to a bedroom and there's a big bed, there's curtain, really big curtain covering a wall, and there are other things on the wall and furniture, the bed, the curtain, that's all going to absorb a lot of sound, a lot of energy, sound energy, right? So then that room's going to sound drier, less reflective. Now, if we walk into a living room, which is much bigger space, there's tile floor, but there's drywall, that room's now going to sound bigger. The drywall reflects sound one way, the tile reflects something another way. You go to a typical recording studio and you see a lot of wood on the walls. Wood is dense, but is porous, and that porous of the wood tend to absorb a lot of the high frequencies, but then reflect more of the mid and the mid-low frequencies. Hence the term a warm wood room, because it's enhancing more the lower harmonics than the high frequency. Okay? That is what early reflection is. And us as humans, when we step into a room and we hear the very first sounds reflected back to us, with our eyes closed, we can say, we're in a bathroom, we're in a living room, we're in a concert hall, there's curtains on the walls, there's probably wood here, there's probably concrete here. Just because of the frequency response of the room and how that first couple of reflections get back to our ear define the characteristics of that room. So early reflection is what plugin manufacturers and hardware manufacturers for reverbs use to extrapolate the entire tone of that reverb, because here's the sound of a tile bathroom, and now I'm going to extend that sound and decay it for however long the client wants with these fundamental characteristics. Everybody following? Thumbs up. Good. Second is pre-delay. Pre-delay is not the first little couple of reflections, but the first wave of reverb that hits you. Remember, reverb is multiple delays in series that are happening as my voice hits the wall in front of me, the walls to the side, the ceiling, and the floor. It bounces a couple of times and then it gets back to my ears. That is the reverb of this room. Okay? So the length of time it takes for the big bulk of these waves to hit me, that is the pre-delay. The pre-delay is defined also by the distance of the source to the listener. For example, Normally I do this in the classroom, where if I suddenly stand a foot away from Gabriel, you will hear me really, really close. It's going to be very uncomfortable, but you're gonna hear my voice immediately, directly. And because behind you there is a wall that's 10 feet away, my voice is going to carry past you, hit that wall, and bounce back, and then get to your ears. And let's round the numbers of, for every foot is 10 milliseconds. It's more close to 11 milliseconds, but let's keep it an even number for simple math. So that means that my voice is going to take 10 milliseconds to get to the back of the wall, and then 10 milliseconds to get back to you, Gabriel. So there's a 20 millisecond delay between my voice and the pre-delay, the wave of reverbs getting to your head. But if I now move all the way to the back of the room and I stand 10 feet away from you, what's going to happen is my voice is going to be projected towards you, but my voice is also going to hit the walls and the ceiling and the floor. And since there's a sizable distance from me to you, my voice is going to bounce off that tile floor and reflect back up to you, and that's going to take a little more time than the direct voice, but not nearly as much time as my voice to the back wall when I'm a foot away from you. So what tends to happen is now my voice directly is going to take 10 milliseconds to get to you, but the voice that bounces off the floor and then go up to you might take an additional 5 milliseconds. So now you're hearing my voice and the pre-delay 5 milliseconds after. So a shorter pre-delay tells you that you are farther away from the source, because you're hearing more of the room arrive to your ears at a closer time than the direct source. So let's go back to that Spanish Harlem song. She sounds really close because there is little pre-delay on her vocal. The acoustic guitar sounds even closer because there's even more pre-delay on her vocal. You hear her voice, on the guitar. You hear her voice and you hear the guitar, and it takes a while for you to hear that wave of reverb hit you, right? As a contrast, when you hear the shakers or the maracas come in, you're hearing those shakers with the verb. There is no separation. You don't hear the vocal verb, shaker verb. It's all blended into one. Because I hear a lot of early reflection blended into the shaker sound, meaning that was some sort of, let's say, church, and I hear the tonality of the church merged and blended in immediately with that maraca, and then the verb tail moves along with the maraca towards me. I keep changing maraca, shaker, same thing. That means that percussion element was farther away, blended in with the characteristics of the reverb. You guys still following me?
Yeah.
Okay. And I want you to keep that clear, that early reflection, you're defining the tone. Pre-delay you use to define the depth, the distance and space between the original source and the reverb. So then what's reverb decay? Reverb decay is now that you started hearing that pre-delay, that first wave of reverbs. Now you're going to dial up how long is that wave of reverbs. Is it 500 milliseconds, 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds? Okay. And there are several other characteristics that you manipulate within that reverb decay to define the tone and also further the tonality that the early reflection starts with. You can then manipulate the reverb decay more to then shape it in all sorts of ways. But reverb decay just deals with the longevity and the tonality of the reverb tail, nothing else. So now let's hear all these characteristics. This is the Relab VSR S24. This is their clone of the System 6000 by TC Electronics. I love TC reverbs. I've had a long career using TC verbs at Fat Planet and at other studios like Bob's, at Digital Domain. He has a System 6000 in his mixing room, and I've been trained by him over and over on how to dial it up. So when they came up with this plugin and they imitated the GUI pretty much exactly to how the original was, it just made me feel at home. And the end results of this verb, it sounds amazingly well. Okay, I haven't compared it, but I'm familiar enough with the sound of this type of reverb that I'd say close enough for me. Okay, the good thing about this type of verb of TC is they give you the options of independent control of your early reflections and of your reverb. And when they say reverb, they are bunching up the pre-delay and reverb tail as one. There's no necessarily separation in volume, because they're both components of the same thing, right? Reverb pre-delay just defines when you're going to start hearing that reverb tail, but then the volume of that reverb tail is a whole other thing. So you have early reflection volume, reverb tail volume. And then you can define the color and the response of the early reflection here, and you can adjust the response of the reverb here. And this is the main page when you get some basic things. Then you can get into early reflection, more in depth, reverb, more in depth, and modulation, which we'll get into now. So let's just hear vocal going through early reflection. You're gonna hear the vocal, and then you're gonna hear the vocal with 100% early reflection.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too.
That's the early reflection. Notice that suddenly the vocal sounds like it's in a room versus.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too.
There's no real length to this. There's no necessarily long decay or anything. It just suddenly places it somewhere, as opposed to reverb.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too.
This adds length to it. This is defining the tone, right? And depending how you have this set, it tends to push the vocal back into the mix. But this each of these are creating a different effect to the vocal.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there buried.
Okay, so you guys are hearing now the difference between early reflection and reverb. Let's adjust now the pre-delay and hear what happens. Now this is going to be a little confusing. TC Electronics definition of pre-delay is not what I'm telling you is pre-delay, which is what everybody else defines pre-delay. They consider pre-delay, they call pre-delay reverb delay. Okay, so and you're going to see me dial reverb delay up, which is, again, pre-delay for pretty much everybody else. Let me mute the early reflections.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one in.
Notice that the longer, the higher the pre-delay, the closer that vocal sounds to you, and the farther away that the verb sounds. Versus here.
And where can we go from here?
And I go back to 165.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it.
Hopefully that helps explain to you guys a little better that difference between pre-delay. If you're closer to the source, you're going to hear that vocal drier immediately, and then the verb afterwards. But now we're listening to this without early reflections. So let's add the early reflections.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling.
So if you're trying to dial up a vocal and give it some sense of space, but create some sort of effect where the vocal is sort of floating in front of you, so it sounds kind of detached from the song, but you still want to add some tail and lushness to the vocal, manipulating the early reflection versus reverb ratio is important, as well as a longer pre-delay. Everybody still following me here?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. It's going to get more complicated, so just hold on. These three parameters are what I start with when I'm trying to define the stage, when I'm trying to define the space that I'm performing. And I tend to create 2 to 3 types of reverbs based on whatever I dial here first. So for example, let's create a visual. I want that voice, the singer, to sound like he's 2 feet in front of me. Then I want the guitars, the keyboards, and whatever percussion to sound like they are 6 feet away from the singer, behind the singer. Then I want the drummer to sound like he's 10 feet away from the singer. And then I want a choir or background vocals that you're hearing on this song sound like those are behind the drummer. Like when they come in, suddenly a curtain lifts, and then there's a choir of 15 people standing on bleachers behind the drummer, and they're about 2 or 3 feet away. So if you try to dial all those layers with one reverb, it's going to be hard, right? Because one reverb is going to define one depth based on the pre-delay. So what's the solution? Create a verb that defines the space that you want. Let's call it a small concert hall. And now you're going to copy those settings to one or two more reverbs, and you're going to manipulate the amount of early reflection, pre-delay, and reverb decay to give you that sensation that each layer is closer and farther away. So let's see if you guys are following. If I want the vocal to start, if I want the vocal to sound like it's 2 feet away, am I going to add a longer pre-delay or a shorter pre-delay?
A longer pre-delay, because you want the room tone, right? Or you want that room space in the reverb.
Correct. And if I want, what am I assigning to the drum verb then? A shorter pre-delay or a longer pre-delay? The drummer's 10 feet away from the singer. Go ahead, Jackson.
I'm guessing, but I'm guessing a shorter one.
Yes, because you're gonna, since he's farther away, you're gonna hear the direct sound of the drums blended in more with the room reverb because of the sheer distance. It's just gonna, the farther away that instrument is, the more time the space that you're at has time to blend in with the original source. So if I want the vocals to sound in your face, I'm going to do this.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there.
Now, notice that this pre-delay is so long that it sounds like a slapback. It sounds like you're in a stadium and the drums are bouncing around. The drums sound in your face. And this interferes with the rhythmic performance, right? So now let's change the parameters to work better with the drums.
This is the drum, just the reverb, or just a part of the drums?
Say that again.
Is this a certain part of the drums you're sending to the reverb or the whole drum bus?
I am at this point sending 100% of the overheads and 100% of the snare, and that's it, just for
Okay.
this example. Now those drums sound like they're farther away, and I've adjusted the response of that verb to favor the drum set. It explodes, but it sounds like it's in the back of a concert hall, but it's enhancing it. It's not messing with the rhythmic timing with it, right? Versus, sorry, let me go back to here, sorry. As cool as this sounds, might not be so functional. Again, if the idea is we're trying to create accurate, or trying to recreate an accurate scenario on a stage, this works. So then I've now defined, I've created the verb that is close to you, and I've created the verb that's far away, and then I'll pull up a third iteration of the same verb, and now I tweak the settings in somewhere in the middle between the pre-delay, the early reflection, and the reverb tail to figure out where that mid-line on the stage, where the guitars, the keys, and the percussion are going to be. And now I define that as I could define that as a ambient verb, short verb, and long verb. Okay. Well, actually, I define those three as length. You could call it as close, midfield, and distant or long, whatever, however you want to call it. I tend to have that near and medium distance, and then whatever I dial up for the drums, I just call it drum verb. That's the general drum verb that I'm going to use to fit it within that stage. Okay, so let's go back to vocals. Just the vocals. And let's go through how I dial up the other settings. So everybody have a good grasp on early reflections, pre-delay, and reverb?
Yeah, I think I do.
Okay, good. Thumbs up if you guys are hearing me. Okay. Now, let's go through the other settings. Let's start here. Here in early reflections, like I mentioned, is where you define the tonality of the space. The sound of a jazz club, concert hall, Vienna hall, a bathroom, a parking lot garage, all sound acoustically different because of the materials and the space. You go to a bathroom.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too.
Versus you go to a castle.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too.
Okay. I tend to like the Vienna hall a lot.
And where can we go from here?
There's a low end richness to this hall location, and there's a couple of things that they add. There's a variation to it, so the algorithm can sound two different ways, characteristic wise, and then there's also front and near. So this means front is like you have front row seating. You are within the first 5 rows of the stage, so you're hearing the sound coming off stage a little sooner than you're hearing the sound of the instruments hit the back and the surrounding walls and get back to you. Versus if you're on the rear, you're like all the way in the back wall, almost nosebleed section, so you're hearing just as much hall reverb as the direct sound, which is great. That's another thing that you can do to help you define location. You can create the vocal verb with the front, and then the drum verb can be with the rear. Okay, let's stay with the rear. Here you can adjust the parameters of how that earlier reflection is starting and stopping. Is it kind of fading in slowly, or is it happening immediately, and then is it just fading out abruptly, or is it taking a little longer to fade out? And then just simple kind of like a shelving, high and low shelving. Are you making that room sound brighter or darker? Let's get into what gets even more complicated. Let's get into reverbs. So there's a couple of things that you need to understand of reverb. One, the easiest. What's reverb time? How long is that reverb going to take to die out? A lot of manufacturers dictate that based on the RT60, meaning in 60 seconds how much energy is there within that reverb. Let's just stick to the simple definition of, if I clap, I'm going to hear that instrument, that verb, for about 1 second before it just kind of gets so low that it's unperceivable. Simple enough, right? But and then the next thing would be size, and that's pretty easy also to understand. Where if we go by let's say square feet, or even better volume, cubic feet. If this space is a 300 cubic feet space, which is basically the size of a small room, it's going to sound small. But if we go to a concert hall for 2,000 seating, that seats 2,000 people, that's a big space. What changes do you hear within those different spaces? You hear that the reflections happen quicker in a small space, versus in a longer space, you hear that it takes longer for that vocal to hit those walls and bounce back at you. But there's also a different characteristic to that. We use low-end decay to define how big the room sounds. The better low-end can transmit within a space, it gives us the sensation that the room is bigger. Hence, if you're in a living room, the low end of your voice is going to sound different than if you go to that large concert hall and you sing in that large concert hall. There's going to have more space for those low end frequencies to develop and bounce back. So let's kind of mess around. Let's keep this at 1 second and mess around with size. Here's small size on the vocal. And then just to be fair, let me just put everything flat here so we're not confusing ourselves. And we'll get to that now.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too.
Versus the biggest space it can offer.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too.
You could say that that is changing the reverb time because it takes longer for it to die out. But your reverb time is almost defined by energy and levels, perceived levels, right? The size is considered a different parameter where you're hearing more reflections and longer for the very tail ends to develop. But notice just the low end of the vocal.
And where can we go from here?
Versus,
I know you felt it, I felt it too.
again,
Well, I think I know.
that lower chestiness of voice gets thinner. It doesn't get emphasized by the short verb. So you want a bigger sound. It's not just the time that it's not just how long it takes for that verb to swell and develop that crest, that envelope. It's also how the low end responds to the room that gives us cues. So let's kind of put this down the middle. And then what is diffusion? Diffusion is the reason I have this back wall here and I have some of the other treatment in the room. Diffusion is you purposely breaking up the reflections on walls. If you have a perfect cube and let's say you have a fish tank and perfectly still, it's a cube, you drop a pebble in the middle, that's going to create a ripple in the water that's going to hit all four walls at the same time, and they're going to create this perfect reflection back, and you're going to see all those waves hit you in the middle. That is basically no diffusion, because the sound is hitting the walls and is being reflected almost in the same shape, same intensity as it was created originally. Now, if I take the walls of that fish tank and I add triangular plastic all around, and I drop that pebble, what you're going to notice is as the ripple of water hits the peaks of those triangles, it's going to shatter that perfect wave, and then whatever hits the peak is going to reflect back, and then whatever hits each different portion of that angle of that triangle going down is going to reflect at different times, all the way until it gets to the very end of the triangle. That's the last thing that's going to reflect. But it's not going to reflect perpendicular. It's not going to reflect exactly right back. It's going to deflect at an angle. So then now it's going to reflect down. And then over here, there's triangles also, and that's going to shatter that wave into even more pieces, and then that's going to bounce in a whole bunch of other directions, and eventually some of that's going to get back to the middle where the source is. That's diffusion. That is creating a sort of chaos to the original source, making the sound, the reflections, take longer to die out. But not just that, they bounce around a lot longer and in different intervals to get back to you, creating a smoother response to the verb. Versus if there's no diffusion, you're going to hear your voice bouncing back almost like a delay, instead of what we would consider this nice verb. So let's hear minimum diffusion, which is, it's not no diffusion, it's just minimal diffusion, versus all the way diffused.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than.
It might be a little hard to hear the difference, but if you just pay attention to the very tail end of the reverb, you're going to hear that that tail end kind of just drops off abruptly. And you can tell the lyrics based on what the reverb, how the reverb sounds better. That when you get to more diffuse, the intelligibility of the message on the verb gets a little harder, and you hear a little more of the tail smoother like a smoother decay, a little bit of a longer decay, especially on the top frequencies. Listen again.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more.
Is that perceivable for you guys? Sort of. This might take a little time for you to mess around with it. Each reverb plugin is going to have its own definition of how much is diffusion or not, but play around with it and understand that you're trying to smear that verb more or less. Okay. Some plugins, when you put minimal diffusion, it really does start sounding like almost like a ping pong delay, because you can almost define the different wave bursts, reverb bursts. Okay. So let's get to what TC Electronics calls color. Okay. You have high, you have high crossover, mid crossovers. There's a high, mid, low, mid, and a low crossover. Why is this here? You will find early on, especially with lexicon reverbs and lexicon type reverbs, that you will see a high crossover and a low crossover. And then you will find another setting that's going to be a high multiplier and a low multiplier. If you go to any of the A or B rooms and start using the precocity there, you will notice that there's a high crossover and a high mult. That means this: that reverb time defines the amount of reverb decay for the mid-range, for the total space. Then you as a user can say, you know what, I want it to sound like if I put carpet in this hall that is so thin it's really absorbing just the high frequencies but not really doing anything to the mid, lows, and the lows. And I'm going to say that everything from 4K and above is going to be absorbed by that carpet. So I'm going to say I'm going to put a multiplier of 0.5. And that means that I'm multiplying 1 second by 0.5, which means now the decay of high frequencies from 4.24 kilohertz and above is going to be half a second.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one.
Let's say I don't like that. I actually want the room to sound brighter. So now I'm multiplying it by 1.5. So now the decay of 4K and above is going to be 1.5 seconds instead of 1 second.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too.
Let's say that's a little too bright. Let's just meet somewhere in the middle there. Now I'm like, I want to thicken up that voice. So I'm going to boost the multiplier of low frequencies that starts at 408 hertz. And I'm going to do 1.5. That means, again, the reverb time just for the frequencies of 500 hertz and below is going to be 1.5 seconds.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think.
And then maybe that's too much. Let me try it the opposite way.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do.
Now, TC allows you to have two mid band controls. Most plugins and most of the manufacturers don't. They just give you one. Especially Lexicon tends to be the reverb time is for whatever mid-range frequencies happen to be between the high crossover and the low crossover. I like the extra tweakability of this, and then let me show you how I'm going to use this. I'm going to push this a little more to the air band, 6K, and I'm going to leave this between 6K and 1.5K. So here's going to be more of control on reverb on the diction, the T's, the P's, and since he's kind of more talking than singing, and he doesn't have a lot of sustain on those notes, I am going to lower the high mid to remove reverb space and time from the consonants so the diction clears up, but I'm going to adjust the mid-low that starts at 1.5 to 400, which is more of the notes, that second and third order harmonic from his notes that he's singing. I'm going to stretch that out to add an artificial sustain to his notes that he's really not doing. Here we go.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there, buried inside your soul. And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do. But I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones.
You guys are hearing now how I'm shaping this verb to make the voice sound brighter, thicker, add more sustain to the notes I want sustained, and then allowing just enough reverb to extend a little bit the consonants but not affect it. So if we hear this in context, let me make sure I'm not sending drum to verb. Now we've dialed up a space that works.
And where can we go from here?
And now we've applied all this. Now we go back to the sends. We remove the pre-delays. We remove the pre-fader, right? So now the control of the now the fader is controlling the send to the reverb. Since this vocal's already at -9, the fader for the vocal's -9, I'm sending 9 less decibels to that reverb send. So even though the send is still at 0, you're going to hear 9 decibels less.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too.
And right about this time is when the client is kind of at ease. It's like, oh, okay, this actually works and sounds good, and they start understanding. Normally what I do is I do a little palette cleanser at that point. So when I take the pre-fader off, I mute the track, and then I just lower it all the way down, and then listen to the vocal dry and start bringing up the verb until I feel like that works.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there, buried inside your soul. And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there, buried inside your soul. And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there.
And now that I'm hearing it in context with everything else, I feel like I need to just tweak it a little bit more here. Maybe the vocal was a little too within the room, so I'm adjusting the early reflection so it sounds less in the room. Everybody following till now? Okay, so we have early reflection, reverb, and then the last thing we'll discuss, and they'll have to go, is the modulation. Modulation is variations in dynamics and pitch to the reflections that happen in the room. And you might be thinking, well, how is the pitch getting changed in the reverb? Well, that happens naturally as frequencies hit different surfaces. If there is a theater curtain that the sound needs to go through, some of the frequencies, mainly the high frequencies, will get absorbed. Other frequencies in the mid frequencies that are the wavelengths is big enough and they're strong enough will get through the cloth, hit the wall, and bounce back. But that curtain becomes an impedance change. And that impedance change is slowing down the sound. And what happens when you slow down the time of audio, you're varying the pitch. You're slowing down, you're lowering the pitch, right? And you're also partially losing energy as it goes through the curtains. So the dynamics of that sound is changing because some of the energy is being lost. Not completely though. So as it goes through this curtain, it's changing the impedance, it's changing the energy, and that misshapen vocal now reacts to your ears differently. So let's listen to this verb again on pre with no modulation.
Where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do.
Now, this plugin offers you a couple of different options. I really like the front and rear options or the left and right options. And let's define that first by the easiest, left and right. That means that it's going to create a change in dynamics and pitch differently in the left and the right. And what happens now is it's going to make that reverb sound wider, because when you have a perfect reflection on the left and the right and it bounces back to you, you have higher amount of comb filtering happening, because it's the exact same vocal reflected back at you. And that tends to give you the sensation of that vocal, at the more verb you have, the more it pushes it back, because of that smearing of the vocal, it being so equal. So now when you put modulation and a left-right modulation, you start feeling that that vocal doesn't get sucked into the room as much. I'll go between none and left and right.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there, buried inside your soul. And we're
So you hear a little bit of a difference there, and you hear the vocal just move a little bit closer, and those high frequencies detach a little bit. They have the other option of front to rear, which means that as the sound moves farther back into the room, the more it gets modulated, which kind of gives you this sensation of it being a longer haul, which is pretty cool, actually. Let's start with off, no vocal, and I'll turn it on and off without the vocal, and then I'll add the vocal.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there, buried inside your soul. And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too.
Okay? Again, these are subtle differences, but understanding modulation is really critical into helping you not just shape the sound, but help create the right amount of gel or separation, definition between verb and vocal. A lot of people stay away from using reverb or use it minimally because they feel that it always pushes their vocal back, and they tend to rely more on delays. Nothing wrong with that, but I don't want you to do that out of not understanding how to manipulate it and understanding how to dial a verb correctly. It should be as a production mixing decision, not a, well, verbs just automatically suck things back. They don't. If you adjust your early reflection, your pre-delay, and your modulation, you can have tons of control on that vocal.
And where can we go from here? I know you felt it, I felt it too. Well, I think I know I do, but I need you to know it too. It's the feeling of loving someone else more than the one inside loves himself. It's knowing that the ones that you've lost are forever there, buried inside your soul. And where can
Okay? You have a question?
Hey, yeah, I'm sorry, I do have to go, but I wanted to ask about when you were describing how you set up your reverb for a staging, and then go back to apply the plugins that you want to kind of create the dynamic effects on each instrument. Are you choosing you're not choosing a preset for your reverb when you do that and then basing it on that preset, are you?
Uh, here is
And if I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just thinking if like the reverb comes with like plug-in presets for like small dark church or dark hallway, things like that. Is that the kind of imaging you're creating when you stage?
um reverbs are the one plugin or hardware unit where I do start with a preset because there's so much that you need to dial up into that. So I will do the same thing I was doing. Here's the vocal soloed, here's 100% send to that verb, and I am moving around different presets until I hear something that I'm like, that sounds cool. That's the energy, that's the life, that's the tonality that I want, that's the depth that I want.
Okay.
Then I do a save as, like you saw me do, call it vocal verb one, and then I start dialing it up until I get something that I want. Because it becomes easier that way versus a compressor and an EQ are so dependent on that source that to me it's just quicker to just, oh, this is what I need, boom boom boom, that's it. On a verb, it has to be almost more of like a feeling type of thing, and in my head I am already trying to make a decision of how big it should sound, how small it should sound, is it brighter or darker. So I'm looking for those specific presets. uh, Dark warm room, bright hall, whatever that is, and then work my way down from there. And sometimes I'll dial something up for about 10, 15 minutes and I'm like, nah, let me just find something else.
And
But
then
but
my
it
last
is, go ahead. Let me finish here. But when I do this, easily I will spend an hour just dialing up these verbs to create the stage before I move on to doing anything else. Go ahead.
when you do the save as for each of them, it saves it to that channel or it saves it to that particular
Plugin.
plugin that you're using. So you don't have to add multiple reverbs to do this, what you're doing.
Well, I am saving. I'm creating a preset. I'm creating these settings. So then, for example, if now I've created this verb, it sounds great as a vocal. For it works right on vocals. I'm gonna now call this vocal two. Now I'm gonna apply. Apply that verb to the drums. I will duplicate that track, right? And then that'll duplicate the signal path and it'll duplicate the verb plugin, right? Let me just make all this inactive for now, and I will route this to another drum bus, a drum verb. Let's just do this for as an example. I'll call it drum verb. There you go. And then I go to the drums and I send the different channels to that drum bus, to the drum verb. And then I'll create another aux, copy paste that plugin, and dial up that third verb also with the different parameters. So I will have 3 different instances of this verb, each one with slightly different parameters.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I see that.
Okay, so at the beginning of this class, when I asked you create this template with three buses for verb, 3 buses for delay, this was the end goal. So now your template is ready for those 3 verbs. Create, go to the first verb, create it, dial it from there. Copy paste that plugin by holding down Option and drag it onto the next 2 auxes, and then manipulate it for the other 2. And then next class we'll get into delays. Okay, and just to make sure I'm covering everything for this class, we are setting up and routing time-based effects. We've created verbs, how to create a stage setting, and then we've briefly talked about reverb as an effect. more in the sense of sound design, but we'll get in a little more into that in the next class. Cool?
Okay, cool.
Yeah, cool. Sounds good.
Great. I'll see you guys next Friday at the normal time. Okay?